Hey guys, today we're going to shift gears a little bit. So, the last week and a half or so, we have been looking at organic molecules. We have looked at proteins, including enzymes. We have looked at carbohydrates, and we've looked at lipids. We've looked at how they can be energy sources, they can be structural components or building blocks, how they're necessary for the health and the survival of cells and living things. And all of it has been in preparation of getting into the chemical reactions, the complex chemical reactions of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which will be our next unit. Um, but there's one more thing that we're going to look at before we are ready to kind of say goodbye to this unit and really focus on cellular respiration and photosynthesis and those chemical reactions. And this is the idea that those things are related, that chemical reaction of photosynthesis is related to cellular respiration and how they relate and how they work together. Um, and so we're going to go ahead and jump into this coloring sheet. And again, this one's a little bit different. As always, I want you to be reading along with me, and you can pause and highlight and underline as you need to, and get the notes and the drawings as you need to. And so there we go. Let's go ahead and get started. Begins by saying the total amount of energy that exists in the universe remains constant, but energy can change from one form to another. There's this idea that we learned the Newton's laws of thermodynamics, that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form. All the energy that God created in the universe was there from the very beginning. It's not like there's more energy or new energy being created every day. And this is a secular worksheet, but even from a secular concept, the amount of energy is constant. There's not new energy created and energy being destroyed. It just changes form, right? And it gives this example. For example, chemical energy in gasoline can be released and transformed into heat energy and the energy of motion, which you might remember from physical science is kinetic energy. And so what started off as chemical potential energy in the gasoline becomes thermal energy, becomes kinetic energy, and it just changes form, but the amount of energy is the same. It's just becoming a different form, right? Um, says this type of energy transformation occurs in many of the processes that take place in living things. And so as we're looking at these chemical reactions, a lot of them involve energy transformations. And if you remember from physical science last year, if you had it, or preview for my ninth graders, when chemical reactions take place, they absorb energy and they release energy, but the total amount of energy before and after is the same. Um, let's go ahead and kind of look. It says, in this plate, we will examine the flow of energy through living things and identify the molecule that serves as the main energy source in all of life's processes. And you should be able to guess what that molecule is. So we're going to look at how energy flows, and what is the molecule that is the main energy source. And if you haven't already guessed it, that main energy source is ATP, right? That's the molecule that serves as the main energy source in all of life's processes is ATP. So we're going to look a little bit at ATP and a little bit at how energy through all of these chemical reactions kind of changes form. Let's jump down to this part here. All of the energy on the Earth comes from the sun. Mind you, this is just here on this planet. There's a lot of energy out there in the universe. The sun doesn't feed the entire universe. But all of the energy on the Earth comes from the sun. And the sun's energy is what drives all of the chemical reactions and processes of life on our planet. If there was no sun, there would be no life on our planet. And in fact, the sun has to be exactly the distance that it is, right? So the energy that we have to carry out our life processes comes from the sun. So this solar energy is trapped. And that's what this sheet is going to get into is how does the sun's energy fuel everything that goes on here. This solar energy is trapped in a photosynthesizing organelle of a plant called a chloroplast. And so the beginnings of our planet accessing the energy from the sun is in plants. Plants capture that sunlight. They capture it in particular in their chloroplasts. Chloroplasts, of course, are green in color because they are filled with a green pigment called chlorophyll. And that green pigment is able to capture every color and wavelength of light except for greens and blues. Those are reflected off of it. And then the other plastids, they also can capture energy in the form of light in different colored wavelengths. So pink plastids would capture combinations of blue and red light. Yellow plastids would capture orange light and yellow light and red light and green light. And orange plastids catch orange. So like there's, each one captures different types of light. And if you're physical science, you might remember how all of those colors all related and how filters work. If you don't, it's okay. So the chloroplast at that point, though, what main idea of this is that the chloroplast is the organelle that captures the sunlight, right? So plants all are made of plant cells. Plant cells have chloroplasts, and the chloroplast is what captures the sunlight. So this is where this process begins. Goes on to say a number of chemical reactions take place in the chloroplast to transform the solar energy into chemical energy. Again, photosynthesis is a complicated chemical reaction, a complicated chemical process. It's a lot of different reactions to do the whole entire process. To transform solar energy into chemical energy. Carbon dioxide and water are necessary for the process of photosynthesis, and the products of photosynthesis include carbohydrates. Let's go ahead and highlight or underline this first of all. So remember reactants and products. Essentially, carbon dioxide and water are the reactants, right? CO2 and H2O are the reactants. If you don't remember what reactants are, then go back to your enzyme sheet. It's the substances before a chemical reaction. And then the product is a carbohydrate. In particular, it's usually glucose. And so this is a huge, long, drawn-out chemical process whose reactants begin as carbon dioxide and water, and then the product that they ultimately form is a carbohydrate molecule, usually a glucose molecule. Okay, and so it's going to represent these in different ways in the drawing. So the carbohydrates, it represents as a candy bar. Remember that carbohydrates are sugars, so that's why they picked a candy bar for that one. So when you see candy bar, think carbohydrates. And the product is carbohydrates and molecular oxygen is what's called diatomic oxygen. Oxygen likes to have a certain number of connections. You might remember oxygen likes to have 2 connections. And one oxygen molecule by itself is missing those 2 connections. So that basically looks kind of like this. Oxygen wants to have 2 connections to something. So in the case of the oxygen that you breathe, it is pure oxygen, but the breathable oxygen that we have is what's called diatomic because it has 2 atoms of oxygen attached together, right? And so that's one of the products as well. And so molecular oxygen is referring to that. Goes on to say the bonds of carbohydrates now contain some of the sun's energy. When the plant forms a glucose molecule, the bonds between all those carbons and hydrogens and oxygens have the energy from the sun inside of them. And that's energy that's stored inside of those relationships, inside of those connections. Photosynthesis transforms the sun's energy into the chemical energy of a carbohydrate. Let's go ahead and highlight or underline that one. And oxygen is giving off as a waste product of photosynthesis, a byproduct, they sometimes call this. A byproduct is something that is made during this reaction, but it's not a necessary part of the reaction. It's not like the point of the reaction. The point of this chemical reaction is to make the carbohydrate. The fact that some oxygen is formed in the process it's a byproduct. It's an extra, a bonus, right? And so they call it the waste product of photosynthesis because the plant does not need the oxygen. It needs the carbohydrate. In fact, the oxygen it ends up getting rid of. It releases it back into the atmosphere because it does not need it. It's a waste product, a byproduct, right? And so let's go ahead and kind of flip this over a little bit and look at this drawing. And in this drawing, you're basically getting at kind of 2 different reactions. And I'm gonna use a highlighter to kind of split this up a little bit, right? About there. right? And on one side, we have photosynthesis. And on the other side, let me flip this upside down, we have cellular respiration. And just by doing that line and writing those two parts, you can see that these two processes are related, that they work together, that they cannot happen on their own. They need each other, right? But this side focuses on photosynthesis. And so it starts with this idea that solar energy, which is why they have the sun, right? Solar energy is trapped by chloroplasts. So you can see the solar energy being trapped by the chloroplast. This right here is the chloroplast, right? In an autotroph. You might remember heterotrophs and autotrophs from that section that we read at the beginning of this unit. Autotrophs are the organisms that they can make their own food through chemical reactions. They do not need to eat other organisms or consume other organisms or somehow absorb other organisms. They can make their own food, right? And so all autotrophs have, most autotrophs have chloroplasts. There are chemoautotrophs instead of photosynthetic autotrophs, but that's a different story. So the autotroph has these chloroplasts, and that's where the solar energy is trapped, right? And so that's kind of this first process that's going on here that it mentioned, right? And then it mentioned that the plant inside of the chloroplast uses that energy, because it takes energy to make things, right? So it uses that energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into a sugar, right? So kind of as the next reaction, we have carbon dioxide. CO2 is for carbon dioxide. Remember, di means two, right? So carbon dioxide, which was absorbed by the leaves of a plant, and water, H2O, is water, which was absorbed by the roots. Are converted by the chloroplast into carbohydrates. So we have carbon dioxide and water are combined in the chloroplast. The chloroplast needs energy to combine these two, which, by the way, of course, is an anabolic reaction. It's going to combine them two and make a sugar. And a carbohydrate has a chemical formula of C6, what is it, C6O6H6? Oh, I don't remember. So let's just skip that one for now. Sorry, because it's falling out of my brain. I'm going to put some white out on that. We'll get there next week. C6H6O6, two of them are 6 and one of them is 12. It doesn't matter. We'll get there later. So takes energy, though. The point of this is that it takes energy to combine these two and to make a carbohydrate. So that's where the sun's energy comes into place. Basically, this chloroplast is using energy from the sun to make stuff. Just like it takes you energy to make stuff, to do your homework and to make a beautiful project or whatever it is, the chloroplast is going to need energy to make the sugars. And so it uses the sun's energy to take carbon dioxide and water and make them into carbohydrates, which of course are sugars. And the primary one that it makes is glucose. It can make a lot of different things. It sometimes even can make lipids. It's really interesting. But generally speaking, it's carbohydrates, right? So that's kind of what that step is, right? And then kind of separate from that, oxygen, which we're going to call O2, that diatomic oxygen, is released as a byproduct. So again, that's kind of a waste product. So this is what we see here, right? We've got the sun's energy going into the chloroplast, and then the chloroplast uses that energy to take carbon dioxide and water and convert it into sugars. And that's what they're getting at with Snick Snack is supposed to be the candy bar. So we just made some sugars. And after the sugar is made, there's some leftover oxygen, and that's what this tank is representing, right? So that's the process of photosynthesis. Where they become related is the oxygen that is made is used during the process of cellular respiration. And so let's go ahead and look at the process of cellular respiration next. But if you need to pause and copy this, go ahead, pause, and copy the rest of that information, right? Okay, here we go. Let's go ahead and look next at cellular respiration. It says, plants, humans, and many other living things use the carbohydrates as their essential source of energy. This is why plants have to make way more than they need, because it has to last through the food chain, right? So all the other living things in the food chain. It says carbohydrates are transported to an organelle called the mitochondrion, where they are combined with oxygen molecules in the process of cellular respiration. So let's go ahead and highlight or underline all of this too. They all of the cells in all living things use carbohydrates as their essential source of energy. That's that immediate source of energy, right? And the carbohydrates are transported to a molecule called the mitochondrion, where they are combined with oxygen molecules in the process of cellular respiration. Once a cell has a sugar molecule, it has to be able to convert that into energy. The sugar molecule is like the food, right? So if you have food, but you never digest it and convert it into energy, your food didn't do you any good, right? So photosynthesis is about making the sugar molecule, but the sugar molecule is the food source. So once it has the sugar molecule, that needs to be broken down and digested in the same way that you break down and digest your food to get energy out of it. And so cellular respiration is that process of taking the sugars and breaking them down and converting them into energy. That's what cellular respiration is. And this takes place in a mitochondria. Remember that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's what converts the food into energy. So photosynthesis makes the sugars. Cellular respiration breaks the sugar down and gets energy from it, right? Let's go ahead and continue on. During chemical reactions in the mitochondria, mitochondrion with an ION is singular, mitochondria with an A is plural. Weird Latin grammar rules, but let's just roll with that. During chemical reactions in the mitochondria, the energy from carbohydrates is released and used to form an energy-rich molecule called adenosine triphosphate. Let's go ahead and highlight or underline this one as well. And so the sugar is the food source, and the food source is then broken down during cellular respiration to create ATP. Photosynthesis makes the sugar. Cellular respiration breaks the sugar down and converts it into ATP, ultimately is kind of where we're going with that. So adenosine triphosphate, commonly abbreviated as ATP. And notice that it says carbon dioxide and water are the byproducts of cellular respiration. Notice that they are essential for photosynthesis. Let's go ahead and highlight, underline that. So if we're talking for this one right here, this is photosynthesis. Woo. Sorry, can't really see that. So photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water as the reactants, and the product is a carbohydrate. And in order to create that carbohydrate, it's using energy from the sun, because it takes energy to build a big molecule, which, by the way, is called a macromolecule. For cellular respiration, the reactants are carbohydrates. And the products are ATP, CO2, and H2O. And so the primary thing that they're trying to form in this reaction is the ATP, right? The CO2 and the H2O are the byproducts. They're kind of the waste products that are released, because what the cell needs is the ATP at that point. It does not need the carbon dioxide, which you then breathe out. Every time you breathe out, if you're a multicellular organism with lungs, then you're breathing out that waste CO2 from all of your cells. All that CO2 from your cells collects in your lungs and you breathe it out, right? And all of the water that's wastewater from cellular respiration collects in your bladder and you pee it out. So there's kind of the reactants and the products for each of these, reactants and products for photosynthesis and the reactants and products for cellular respiration. Let's go ahead and kind of flip at this moment. But real quick, to summarize, the energy of the sun is first transformed into the energy of carbohydrates and then into the energy of the ATP molecule. So in this particular case, now we're looking at the cellular respiration side. And basically we have this O2 combines with carbohydrates. I'm running out of room. Combines with carbohydrates in the mitochondria, right? And so that's kind of that step there. The oxygen, and this is the O2 that was right here. Notice this arrow is taking this O2, right? And it's combining now with the carbohydrates. So this carbohydrate, together these two things combine in the mitochondria, combines with the carbohydrates in the mitochondria during cellular respiration. And basically what's happening during this process is the mitochondria convert the oxygen and carbohydrates. I'm just going to write carbs because I'm running out of room. They convert the oxygen and the carbohydrates into ATP. And that's kind of what this is getting at right here, right? That would be kind of this next step. And then CO2 and H2O are released as a byproduct. And so then these CO2 and H2O go here, and you end up with this circle. Sorry, let me move that down so that you can see it. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so pause and go ahead and copy that if you need to. But basically what we have is that this one is using carbon dioxide and water as reactants to create a sugar. And then oxygen is released as a byproduct, as waste. That carbohydrate and the oxygen are then used during cellular respiration to create the ATP molecule. And when the ATP molecule is made, the mitochondrion also releases waste, and it's CO2 and water, which are then used during photosynthesis. And you can see how it creates kind of this circle where the reactants of this one were the waste products of that one. And the waste products of this one are the reactants of that one. And just the products in general of this one are the reactants of that one. And the reactants of this one are converted into products that are then used over here, right? And so ultimately, this creates a circle, right? And one of the primary goals of the circle is to take the energy from the sun and ultimately convert it into chemical energy in the form of ATP. So this is what the sheet looks at next. Let's go ahead and flip over and continue reading. This is just going to look at a brief examination of the ATP molecule. So it says the adenosine triphosphate, or ATP molecule, is shown at the bottom of this page. And the coloring instructions, we'll skip the coloring instructions. Talking about the components of ATP. So components of ATP, these include an adenine molecule, a ribose molecule. So those are the two main parts, is an adenine molecule and a ribose molecule. Right off the bat, you've never probably heard of ribose, but you should be able to tell me what it is because it ends in OSE. So what kind of a molecule is that? If you guessed sugar, then you are correct. So the ATP has an adenine molecule and a ribose molecule. Adenine, it says, is one of the 4 nitrogenous bases found in DNA and RNA. You might remember, like, A always goes with C and G always goes with T. Is that how it was? Adenine and cytosine, or is it adenine and guanine and cytosine and thymine? We'll get there in a unit or two, like 2 units from now. But it's part of DNA. Adenine is part of DNA. Ribose is a 5-carbon carbohydrate. Remember, glucose and fructose both had 6 carbons, some of them in the ring and some of them not in the base ring. But ribose is a 5-carbon carbohydrate. And attached to the ribose molecule are 3 phosphate groups. So let's go ahead and take a look at this ATP molecule. Okay, so as we're looking at this, let's start by coloring this piece. Notice that it's present here and here. And you should be able to tell real quick too what's the difference here, what's going on here. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Then there is this piece right here. And then there are these pieces right here. Again, don't worry about coloring them neat, just kind of get them done. So these are the 3 pieces, right? And it mentioned that there's the phosphate groups, there's the ribose, and there's the adenine. So phosphate groups should be pretty easy. The phosphate groups are the ones that have the little p. We already talked about this with the sodium-potassium pump, that one of those phosphate groups breaks off, and that releases energy, and 7 kilocalories of energy in particular, right? So J3 is the phosphate group. So then one of these is adenine and one of these is ribose. And given that ribose was a 5-carbon sugar, you should be able to figure out which of these is the ribose. And so go ahead and have a guess in your mind. And if you happened to guess the pink one, that is correct. This is the ribose, right? Oops. Wow, let me try that again. Ribose. And then this right here, this is the adenine, right? So we have, here's the adenine molecule, which is connected to the ribose molecule, which is connected to the phosphate groups, right? And these are chemical bonds. So these are the 3 parts of ATP. There's the 3 phosphate groups, there's the ribose, and there's the adenine. And those are the 3 parts. And you can see the key down in the bottom. So you can go ahead and kind of color your key down here as well. My adenine is what I made yellow, my ribose I made pink, and then my phosphate groups I made blue. So there's those, right? And there are those pieces. And so it's telling us the structure of ATP, but this is getting at what happens to that ATP. And we've seen this already with the sodium-potassium pump. So let's go ahead and kind of continue looking on. So living things use energy in the form of ATP, breaking it down into adenosine diphosphate. Remember, di is a prefix meaning 2. So it went from being triphosphate to being diphosphate, and an inorganic phosphate group. Remember that one of the P's is broken off all by itself, one lonely little phosphate, and the other 2 are still attached to the adenosine, and so it becomes adenosine diphosphate, right? Adenosine diphosphate contains adenine and a ribose, but only 2 phosphate groups. And then during this breakdown, energy is released. One of the things we learned in physical science is that when you break molecules apart, those catabolic reactions release excess energy. They release more energy than it takes to get the reaction done. If it's an anabolic reaction where it's building something, that absorbs more energy than it releases. So they are considered to absorb energy, but catabolic reactions release energy. So when it breaks down, when that ATP becomes ADP, it releases 7 kilocalories of energy every single time one of those phosphate groups breaks off, right? We're going to look later on at how the ATP is created. This is cellular respiration, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport, chemiosmosis, and there's a lot. Again, that's just cellular respiration. All of those are parts of cellular respiration, which we will look at next week, right? But essentially what that's getting at here is, here's the ATP with the 3 phosphates. When one of those phosphates breaks off, that releases 7 kilocalories of energy. So that's what I've got for you guys today. You can go back and rewatch any of this that you need to. You can pause and copy here if you need to. Reminder that we have a test coming up on Friday, and that review guide is on the Google Classroom if you need it. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.